All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I think this is actually one of the most important sessions we have here at AWE to think about some of these regulatory and legal roadblocks. My name is Tony Liao. I'm an associate professor. I'm the director of the Cougar Lab in the Cullen College of Engineering at the University of Houston. There's my lab. I'm a research faculty, so we have students in there that are doing all kinds of really cool studies and experiments. Where we're really interested in the social side of AR, VR, and some of the effects of it. But I've also been here for a long time. My entry point into AR, VR started back when it was augmented reality New York meetups. Then it was augmented reality event, and then augmented World Expo. So I've really been following the space for over 15 years or so. And as part of that, I was funded by the National Science Foundation to go all around the world to track this conversation, right? Because they were like, if this is as big as it's going to be, or we think it's going to be, we should have researchers in the room that are mapping what people are talking about, what they're worried about, and what we think is going to happen. And so over the course of this time, I've been going to a lot of different conferences, standards conferences, industry conferences, academic conferences, and of course you see all the augmented World Expos that I've been coming to every year, because this is the place where a lot of that conversation is of course taking place. So one of the things that we've been doing has been mapping a lot of the promises that have been advanced about augmented reality, right? Because for a lot of this time, we've been talking about the future, right? And so a lot of the debates that tend to happen will happen about the future, the things that we're worried about, the things that we're concerned about, the things that we say AR and VR can do, and then the things that we are worried about as far as positive visions of that as well as negative visions of that. And of course, if you just contest one of those characteristics, it can flip very quickly from positive to negative. So our idea is that because so much of this future policy is being contested in the things that we worry about, we really need, one, more research for understanding this, as well as a framework for thinking about how these futures may or may not come true. Okay, there's a lot of futures that are promised here to you all at AWE. Over the last 10 years, I've heard a lot of them, right? That may not come true. But as researchers, we think the value of those futures may not just be in its accuracy, but in its ability to enroll people into that vision. The things that we should be worried about, the things that we think are going to happen, will guide our actions in the present. So a lot of policy actually gets decided based on uncertainty, uncertain science, but then also the futures that we as the industry think is going to happen. So if you do this as long as I do, they start asking you to publish these future directions pieces about what academics and other researchers need to look at. And so we've come up with these frameworks for saying we need people to understand the interrelationship between the industry, between the users and non-users, obviously the content characteristics, as well as many of the devices and capabilities and form factors that we're thinking about. And so each one of these could be independent variables and dependent variables, and then of course they would mutually interact and shape each other in all these kinds of ways, because this is the industry in which we live and the thing that we are looking at. Right? So we actually need way more on all of these questions in order to inform the policies that are coming down the pike, basically. And of course, over the course of coming to this conference, we've done 10 years of promises and futures across the AR life cycle to see what has ebbed and flowed, what kinds of visions were more or less persuasive, how people really are talking about these things in order to marshal resources and support behind consumer AR, enterprise AR, different verticals, different industries, and all that kind of stuff. So our feeling is that policy and regulation is coming, and it's already sort of percolating in the space. And of course, a lot of companies or a lot of industries are trying to think about this, and we'll get calls about, hey, we're trying to do this thing. What are some of the things that you know, or what are some of the things that the academic side is saying about these things? And really, what we think is that there's a lot of ways that this could go, okay? And there's a lot of different issues that we need to consider, because this could go a lot of different ways, and we can base this off of previous policies, previous regulations that have come about when it comes to regulating technology. right? So if you think about timing, you could have preemptive, right? Things that we're worried about that we fear or we think that we need to stop before it happens, okay? So like cloning bans, for example, that was very much a futures ethical thing, and the government was like, we just don't want to go there, right? Then, of course, there's maybe real-time regulation as the industry is forming, and then there's reactive to some sort of seminal event or some sort of moral panic that arises when it comes to AR, VR, XR technologies. Then, of course, there's a wide range of stakeholders who would have a say in thinking about this regulation or would need to be consulted about this regulation or will be the subject of regulation, whether that's tech companies, governments, academic researchers, the general public, what you can or can't do, various agencies or advisory councils that would weigh in, right? So it could be preemptive, real-time, or reactive. It could be about or to any of these stakeholders, where academic researchers, for example, may have funding restricted for certain types of research, or we get regulated in other kinds of ways as well. Then you might think about, okay, so yes, regulation policy is going to happen. Who's going to do that, right? So it could be self-regulation, right, where sometimes they say, hey, industries, you just write your own policies, right, or you tell us what you think would be the best guidelines. Some of these may come from academic proposals or law reviews as we start thinking about, okay, seriously, if we want to think about how we craft these things, then maybe we should start looking at precedent, maybe we should start talking to our lawyers, maybe we should start thinking about what it is that would actually work to restrict the type of behaviors or the types of things that we don't want to have happen. Governments and think tanks, they will write white papers and other kinds of things, or it might be community driven by different groups such as this, or the different meetup communities, different standards organizations, regulatory initiatives, accessibility organizations that are cropping up around here, right? So there's a lot of places it could come from, and then it's like, which one of these gets picked up, or which ones do we decide is going to be the leader standard on who has written those regulations. There could be a very top-down process, right? And maybe this is sometimes the reactive one where something happens and some entity is like, we got to fix this, right? And we're coming in and it doesn't matter, this is the rule. Or it could be a bottom-up one where we decide or we collaborate with industry, academia, et cetera. And it could be co-constructed as some mutual conversation between those two entities. The subject of regulation, that'll be what Brian talks about more, because there's a lot of sort of hot button issues that we might foresee coming up that will really be at issue. Certainly national security, cybersecurity, certainly a lot of the content questions that haven't been solved with the internet, and now we have to port over to AR, VR, and think about how it's going to be worse or more serious and those kinds of things. Certain behaviors or actions that are now possible or enabled in AR, VR that are problematic, as well as a lot of effect side, right? And this is mostly where my research or my thought lives, is like, we bandy around these things that are like, oh, it's going to be this more presence or more immersive or more this, more that, without necessarily sometimes having the science to back those things up. And then, of course, children are always a subject of more regulation when it comes to media. If you think about, all the different media laws that have been passed specifically about children, whether that's COPA or, George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words, the Supreme Court precedents, so children's always a protected category that is subject to quite a lot of regulation. So then, more decisions after you come, more criteria or more things that may happen in the course of regulating is, do we apply existing laws? Do we create new frameworks? Can we apply existing commerce law to deal with some of these things? Can we apply existing, federal law? Or is AR, VR so radically new that it's like the internet where we have to reconstruct all of these frameworks and laws because of how new it is, because of the point of view, because of the presence, and those kinds of things. And then within that is sort of, from the perspective of the policymakers, what is your legal assumption of XR? Right? Is it just as serious to do something in XR as it is in real life? Is it not as serious at all because it's just pixels? Or is it somewhere in between where you can cause real mental harm even though the subject or the victim is not in any way in physical danger because they're remote and distant, right? So a lot of these tricky questions where it pulls apart some of the reasons why we have laws in the first place, where most of our laws, understandably so, have been written for physical space because we've been living in physical space for that long, right? We have not considered only recently some of the things we say, do we need internet law? And then now one more step, what does XR law look like and why should we write these things? Are we saying it's just as serious, or is there some level in between? It's just pixels and it's the most serious thing, and how do we navigate that conversation? Then there's the purpose of the law itself, whether it's to punish, to retribution, deterrent, symbolic, whether it's to incapacitate the people who have done those things, whether it's rehabilitative. We tend not to think about this as much with legal, but that's one of the purposes of law. And then, of course, restricting of that type of action. And then the type of sanction, whether it's criminal, monetary, individual, civil, whether the companies are held accountable, whether you're restricting the access of the individual to certain actions or features that they can or cannot do. We do this with certain things where if you commit certain cyber crimes, you cannot access, different kinds of things, right? So all range of things that you can see, you say, hey, we need more regulation and policy. It could be the enforcement mechanism could be governments. They come in and say, hey, that's criminal, you can't do that. Or it could be corporate, regulate, say, hey, corporations need to implement these in their terms of service or their content policies. And then, of course, markets and public as well, right? You can say economic sanctions, or maybe people will leave your platform if you do X, Y, and Z. So, that's another way of regulating softly without, say, coming in and writing a bunch of laws, okay? So these are the frameworks that we're essentially thinking about, or we've been thinking about very, very seriously in the space, and super glad that you are here to have these conversations because we don't have the answers. But you cannot just say, oh yeah, we need some policy up in here, right? We need some regulation of the XR space. You have to be very, very specific about every one of these criteria, and probably more that we haven't really thought about, because there's so much bundled in that one act of regulating all these kinds of things. So I'll close by saying, look, we need to integrate and hopefully help the academic research community come in on this, where I've been the keynote of a conference last month at the Data Sciences Institute. It was a group of 20 AR/VR labs, such as myself, social science research labs, where we're doing this work. So it's the people who are doing the work on effects, the people who are doing work on neuroscience, psychology, all those kinds of things that will help answer these questions with actual data. There's also another academic research network called the Critical Augmented Virtual Reality Network, of which I am a founder, where we sort of publish these blogs or blog posts or ways of converting academic articles into things that are understandable about power of technology or proper distance or disunity and those kinds of things. So we don't want to just be speaking in this really technical academic way. So my pitch is that social science XR labs, we're out there. We've been doing it for a long time. Now, without maybe industry funding or people who care about these things from the AWE side, then we're mostly chasing NSF, NIH, DOE, or DOD funding and trying to answer those questions. But we really need more on the social side, right? It's not just about engineering and building, and I know there's all these people in the developer tracks and the enterprise side that are really excited about building stuff. But when it comes time to write regulations, the engineers are not going to help you. And I say that as a member of the College of Engineering, right? We're going to be information science, HCI, UX, psychology, social science. That's going to do it. Because we can study populations that are difficult. We've done some studies on 6 to 8-year-old children and say, hey, can they tell the difference between reality or not reality? We can study topics that are difficult. Your company doesn't want to touch the sex side or the romance side on the AR, VR. We've done some of that work where we've looked at AR relationships or, using technology to simulate sex or sexual relationships. Some of the potential negative effects of AR, VR that nobody wants to talk about. We've done some studies on, fear and crime and the things that, get people riled up in these spaces. And then we're the ones that are looking for effects, right? When you have to have regulation that says, hey, what are the effects of X, Y, and Z, then that's usually coming out of our labs where we've been doing some work on the effects of AR, VR media and, the tactile suits and how that interacts with different physical possibilities. So to meet the challenges ahead, we need to support social science XR labs to inform policy and regulation. We need research that's up to date on the current generation of devices so that you're not relying on 1999 data of those generations of VR. We need research and data that's collected with IRB approval and with scientific rigor. and research data that is trusted and objective coming from the academic spaces. So when the moral panic or regulatory push hits, the engineers really cannot answer those questions. So my hope is that you all in the room, hardware and software to academic labs, that's super, super important. You can co-sponsor a testing affects user experience project that's not necessarily a development one. We've had some media companies reach out to say, hey, what's going to happen with children when we put these in the spaces? That's how we did that study with 6 to 8-year-olds. And then, of course, personnel support, not just for me, but the members of our labs for undergraduate or graduate research assistants. So thank you so much. That's the name of my lab. If you want to reach out, that's my email. But if not my lab, I can connect you with the academic XR lab network who may be more specified to your area of expertise or the things that you care about, because we are a really large network, and we're here to help. We're here to answer AR, VR questions, but the academic side is super important in this space, I think. So I'll turn it over to Brian.
So I'm Brian Wassom. I'm a litigator by trade, and I've been involved in this community as long as Tony has as well, in putting a lot of effort into trying to lead the legal thought conversation about what law looks like in this industry. And the technology has certainly grown over that period of time, and the thought process about how to regulate it has as well, not only here academically internally, but also in the actual policymaking space. And so in the 7 minutes that I have to talk to you, I'm just going to leave you, my goal is to leave you with a couple actionable pieces, nuggets of information to give you a sense of where the regulation is likely to come. But really, we do a lot of thinking about this stuff, but you all are the real heroes showing up here at the third day of the conference, first one of the morning, to actually listen about regulatory topics, so kudos to you. I'm going to cite to you 2 different pieces of scholarship that I've found the most insightful on this topic. The first is this article by Rezendi and others on exactly that topic: what topics are likely to be regulated and why, and what should be regulated in the XR space. Apologize for the data dump, but it's just an easy way to get you a lot of information in a shorter period of time. So it breaks down this way: physical safety, mental safety, social safety. Just to pick a couple of these out, not going to go into each of them. Cyber sickness, for example. There are a lot of very recent data suggesting that this hits men and women differently. There are real gendered differences in how we experience motion sickness, cyber sickness, wearing the headset. There's a real push to dig into that and figure out why that is, and make that an accessibility and a justice issue to make this accessible to all. Obviously, malware hacking is always going to be a concern. And again, these are all of these issues, a lot of these issues, some of them are things that are going to get regulated because of the moral panics, because of just this is what policymakers are most likely to jump on. Some of it is spillover from other areas of regulation, AI regulation, because we're going to use a lot of AI in this medium, so it naturally is going to show up in what we're doing here too. And some of it is just you read an article and you say, damn, there needs to be a law on that. This morning, I spoke to a woman who has experienced sexual assault in a VR environment, and you hear that story, you say something needs to be done about this. And so somebody is going to pull a trigger and do something about it. What that's going to be, that remains to be seen. But that's where we talk about harassment and cyber stalking. More and more of this, these VR, virtual, and augmented environments give license to the worst types of behaviors. And so there is going to be political pressure and legal pressure, and rightly so, to build some guardrails around these things. Sometimes the research, and this article in particular highlighted this for me, this is the first time I'd learned this, is that VR social environments have shown, research has shown that this has contributed to an increase in alcoholism. Because what are people doing when they're sitting on their VR boxes chatting with people virtually? They're drinking. I wouldn't have put the two together, but apparently that happens. And so these are the sorts of things that the research can highlight for ways that we can anticipate and again build some guardrails around these things. Tony mentioned children's safety. That's always going to be a hot button concern. And then on the privacy side too, here's where it's easy to get regulation because we already have frameworks for this, especially in Europe and increasingly here in the US. But this breaks down in a lot of discrete ways into how our biometric data and other data can be collected through this media. And to highlight that specifically, I want to give you another citation. And this, Louis Rosenberg, he's here at the conference and done a lot of awesome work in this space. And I wanted to pick one of his articles here that he recently published on, specifically on motion data and how much insight can be gleaned by just the motion data that is necessary for our devices to gather. And when we're using the AR/VR machinery, it needs to know where we are. And we've seen a lot of examples on the expo floor on how we can maximize that information and maximize that experience. But this is, for example, the amount of data that's being collected just in order to be able to deliver to us a real-time experience. And what can be done with this data? These studies show that it is highly possible, highly plausible to take this data and re-identify users, even if they've been anonymized, even if there's no necessarily personally identifiable information on the surface of this, but it can be collected and pointed back and used as a fingerprint to identify someone by their unique gait and all of the different biometric nuances that go along with that and can be combined to uniquely identify a person. This is something that is only going to gather steam as we continue to integrate more data into it. If you've tried the haptic suits downstairs, you know that now we're integrating the sense touch more and more, and all of this stuff can be put together to identify someone, and you apply that to even inferred data. You gather so much information, now you can infer things about their sexual orientation, their age, their race, different behavioral attributes, all things that in existing privacy regulations people ought not know about, that they don't have a legal ground to have this information, and yet it's easy to piece together. We've seen that in other media as well. In social media is a great example how Facebook can piece together insights about us and give you targeted information based on things it shouldn't know about you, but that it can infer based on what you have shared. So the EU has all sorts of existing regulations that hit each one of these bullet points that we've already identified. And we obviously don't have time today to dive into each of them, but again, high-level summary, these are all things to be aware of. The AI Act is being the most recent on this, and in fact, given the different categories under that act, if the software is being sold as a product, as a lot of the things that we're working on will be, it can fall into what's called a high-risk category under the EU's AI Act, and that's where most of the regulation in that act applies to. And that's where it also brings with you the highest consequences. For violating these restrictions, it can be up to 35 million pounds or 7% of your global profits. So it's not a small issue to take into consideration. And all of us, given the inherently global nature of the XR environment, need to be worried about laws not only in the US, but around the world. And we're seeing already the GDPR effect, where if there's not a law on the topic in the US, but there is one in Europe, and we know we're probably going to have impact on European citizens, then we need to start designing for the most restrictive environment. And that's going to be true in the EU, not only for privacy, but as increasingly more XR-specific regulations. In the US, we see a lot of appetite to regulate biometric data, and so it's going to hit these media specifically, very, very directly, as well as AI regulation. And in the US, of course, we have the cowboy mentality to plaintiffs' litigation. I'm already dealing with cookie litigation and any theory somebody can come up with online now to accuse someone of violating their privacy rights. So you can bet when we're harvesting all of this data through our XR devices, it is not going to be long until a creative plaintiff's lawyer is starting to bringing massive class action lawsuits over it. So that's my time, that's my book, and pleasure to talk to you, happy to mingle afterwards.